Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For people who don't know, my name's Peter Joyce. I'm Dean, University of Otago, Christchurch, and it's my pleasure to chair these public lectures. Tonight is the final in our series for this late summer and autumn, and it's my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Caroline Bell. Caroline did her medical degree at Oxford University in the UK, did a research degree and a lot of her training in psychiatry at Bristol with David Nutt, whose name may be known to some people because he's a controversial figure around the world. But we were fortunate that Caroline chose to come to Christchurch in 2001. The last 5 years she's been seconded from the medical school to the DHB to head the DHB mental health response to the effects of the earthquake, and tonight Caroline's going to talk about shaky times, the impact of earthquakes on our well-being. Caroline.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for coming out this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. So, as Peter said, what I'm going to talk about is really what we've seen, what we've all been through over these last 4.5 years. And I'm going to divide the talk into sort of different sections. So first of all, talking about what happened, which I know we know, but actually when you look at the pictures again, it's quite a reminder. And I think as I'm going to talk about the neuroscience, it emphasizes actually how we remember things like this are a bit different. And then I'm going to talk about how people, and very briefly how animals as well, have reacted. And then talk about how understanding some of the neurobiology and neuroscience can help us explain some of the things we've been through, and also think about things that might help. And then I'm going to conclude with what has been helpful, both for people with very severe problems and really for us all, which is very much a work in progress. So first, what happened? This is, of course, the picture of the 22nd of February earthquake. And it's weird when I look at that picture, and it feels at the same time both like yesterday and a lifetime away. And you've got both those things going on in your head. And that's not normally how we remember things. But then what? Obviously, we had further earthquakes, and we had those interminable aftershocks that were incredibly frequent and just seemed to happen just when you didn't want them at night and had a really big effect on us. And then there's been what has been termed now the secondary effects, that everything else that has happened as a result of the earthquakes. And for many people, they've been a lot bigger than the earthquakes themselves. And then the other phase is about rebuilding and moving on, and the challenges with that. And there are becoming new challenges with that currently, particularly people with unsettled claims, and there's a big difference in how that group are functioning compared to the rest of the population. Repair problems coming up now, not just not having had repairs, but people who've had repairs and then having to battle with EQC or insurers all over again. And then people who've had ongoing issues with health and disability or low income and really struggling further with that. So this again is reminding us of some things that were pretty horrible, that dreadful liquefaction. And this poignantly, whenever I talk to insurers, they talk about houses and I talk about homes, because it's so different. You know, where you're living and how that is affected is not just a number. It's a place where you've brought up your family, where all your memories are. And when people's homes are damaged, that's really powerful. Right, and this is just a depiction of the aftershocks. So this is there are so many of them we can hardly see them. But if you think about the second line down, this is over a week. And it was a pretty typical week. We're getting a lot of aftershocks, several a day. Now, a lot of them we wouldn't really feel if they were over 4. They weren't worth looking up from your desk from. But that's a lot of things that we're experiencing for a very long time. So turning now to what did all that do to us and how did we respond? Well, again, I think a structured way of thinking about this is to break it down into different elements. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what are the normal reactions to very frightening, potentially life-threatening events, which the earthquakes were for many people. Then I'm going to talk about how our bodies responded to having those thousands of aftershocks that we all experienced. Then thinking how we respond to having multiple stressful things we have to deal with on top of normal life, which I don't remember being very stress-free before the earthquake. So you've got this whole nother layer of difficulties on top of that. But also reminding us that actually what's happened hasn't all been negative. So I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about this, but a lot of people talk about good things that have happened and things they've learned from the earthquakes. So first of all, reactions to very frightening, sudden things that happen to us. There was an overwhelming feeling of fear, and anxiety isn't the right word to capture it. It was much more kind of primitive than that. It was you could almost feel it in your body. We were getting triggered really easily by things. So not only aftershocks, but anything that sounded like an aftershock coming, that rumbling sound, or most particularly things that made the ground shake. So a truck going by, or the airport was dreadful. I mean, with planes landing. And I was convinced, we may as well all have walked around with "I'm from Christchurch" stamped on our heads, because when a bus went by, we'd all be doing this. And you didn't realise how unusual it was unless you went to somewhere else, like you went to Dunedin or you went to Wellington, and you're doing that, and everyone's looking at you saying, "What are you doing?" And you can't stop it. It was a really primitive reaction we all had. And we were all being pretty wary of multi-storey car parks, shopping malls, not very keen to go into the city even if we could. So really avoiding things that we felt were a threat. Very anxious about being separated from family, and kind of having your cell phone and car keys with you at all times was kind of absolutely what you needed. Forget everything else, but have those. Worrying a lot about what could have happened, what might happen, and your head constantly kind of going round on those kind of loops. And almost universal sleep disturbance. So not only because the aftershocks always seemed to happen just when you got off to sleep, but because we were all pretty alert to being able to respond very quickly. A lot of children moved into the parents' bed again, and it took ages for them to get back out again, and that brought its own problems. And to a degree, going over the things that we'd seen and remembered from that time, things that are called re-experiencing symptoms. So they were pretty universal, not absolutely, but a lot of people had some of those. Then the reactions to the aftershock. So this is our bodies responding to constantly being shocked and made to be on alert by the ground shaking. And as I've mentioned, one of the big things was this exaggerated startle response, this kind of doing that suddenly when the ground would move or you'd hear a loud noise. Constantly being hypervigilant for things. Concentration difficulties being almost universal, I think. People talked about being earthquake brain, and that's frequently described in other disasters as well. And that's gone on for a long time for a lot of people. Well, I've got it. I think a lot of people have got it. Sleep difficulties and fatigue. And the fatigue wasn't just related to difficulties sleeping. When your body's living with that level of arousal, it gets really physically exhausted. And there have been lots of complaints of that. And people being very irritable and easily roused to anger. And probably anger came a bit later, after several months, but it was becoming a real problem in the community. Not just because of the injustices that were happening, but actually people were on a very tight wire. Okay, then the secondary stressors. I mean, lots of people have had lots of these. The really big ones were the battles with insurers, the battles with getting houses repaired, difficulties with renting. Just everything was, for many people, extremely difficult. Some people had a smooth ride, but they were the minority. Families being very disrupted, children with schools, sleep disruption, elderly, relatives moving in, people moving away. There was a lot of change, much more than we usually experience. And the changes to the city and the whole landscape, everything you drive past, walk past, is changed, but it's also pretty broken. And seeing that all the time is quite demoralizing. And I think we must have all the road cones in the Southern Hemisphere because, you know, the roads are just a complete nightmare. And the battling to find a route round that is forever changing makes driving really quite hard work. It's another drain on our resources. And then being limited social resources, and the adolescents and kids talk about this a lot. There's not much to do here, and that's a problem. And then workplace changes, so lots of relocation, shared spaces, doing things differently. So that is an awful lot of things that people are juggling, and that's very stressful. So these are themes that people talked about. They talked about feeling they were being repeatedly hit or punctured on all fronts, you know, at home, at work, just even getting to work was difficult. And that being really exhausting. People going to their GP saying, there must be something wrong with me. I'm just so tired all the time. I can't recover from it. People having difficulty concentrating, and that being a bit of a double whammy, because actually they were needing to make really complex decisions about really big things, their homes, their financial futures, and really having difficulty concentrating. That's really difficult to do. People described feeling overwhelmed by trying to deal with it all and juggle it all. And because of that, almost being paralyzed by being able to make any decisions. It was all just too big and too much. Lots of themes about loss of control, and people didn't really mean that in relation to the ground moving, that obviously we can't control that, but more that we couldn't negotiate a way through processes, that nothing we did seemed to be like it was before. Normally you could make a case, you could write a letter, you could write an email, you could speak to someone on the phone, and you could sort it. Not in this world anymore. And people find that really, really difficult and disempowering. And I've talked about feeling generally lower tolerance for anything. You know, people would snap really easily, particularly in the workplace and in home environments. But depressing, though all that is, not everything about the earthquakes has been negative, and there have been a lot of people who've reported that despite all that, and often that they've had real struggles, they've seen positive things that have come from it. And they've been able to hold both at the same time, which is quite interesting, really. So people describe feeling closer to family and friends, that really realizing how important they are and valuing that time much more than they did before. Generally feeling less materialistic, that actually there's not so much point in just working for things because things get broken, but actually that's not really what you value. It is your family and your friendships and relationships. And really reevaluating what's important in your life and not just carrying on, just really thinking about what's important. Some people describe that they feel they've become a stronger person because of it, that they've learnt about themselves because of the earthquakes, and see that in a positive light. And children have been more mature and responsible. Mine haven't, but some people have said that. I think that's, again, learning from experiences, that actually they've had to deal with an awful lot, and mainly they have. So this figure has been shown an awful lot. And what it depicts, it's really a summary of what previous disasters have told us about the phases of recovery. So it's not saying that all of us go exactly through this, but it's a kind of summary of the processes that most people follow. But the timeline is very variable for different people. So in some disasters, like a flood, they might know it's coming. They can't do anything about it, but they might be able to prepare. So they have a pre-disaster time. Obviously, we didn't have that. And then the disaster hits. For us, of course, that was the earthquakes. And then there's this heroic phase, which is not just about the amazing rescue work and people who did physically heroic things, but it really describes most people's reactions to what they did. Most people, I remember Mike Ardar talking about who's the professor of emergency medicine here. He said, what I saw on that day was most people doing amazing things. And that is what they did. They really helped pretty much everyone in some aspect. Often people sort of put that down, what they did, but just going up to someone else and saying, are you all right? That actually has a huge impact on people. And then there's the honeymoon phase, which is this sense of amazing community cohesion, when you really did feel that you could go up to anyone and ask anything of them, and they would help you. And it was almost palpable in the streets. And that actually felt like life was better than it was before, because life's not normally like that. We're in our own little silos often. So that was a really good feeling. And then there's this phase, which is the sort of disillusionment and gradually rebuilding, when really the enormity of the scale of what has to happen really starts hitting in. And then people gradually come out of this. And it's not a straight line, it's an up and down line, and different things trigger things for different people and make it more difficult. And obviously the timeline of that is very different. If your house hasn't been damaged and your work hasn't been affected and no one you know has been affected, obviously that phase for you is going to happen much more quickly for most people, for those people like that. If you've lost your house, a family member's been injured, people have left town because of it, your life has changed dramatically, it's more likely that that's going to take longer. So it's a sort of helpful guide, but it doesn't mean you couldn't say, we're April the 1st and this is where Christchurch is, which is how politicians want us to answer a question like that, but that's impossible to answer it like that. Now, the one other point I wanted to highlight was this line here is purposely drawn higher, like at a better level of functioning than this pre-disaster line. And what that is reflecting is this concept of post-traumatic growth, that people or communities that have really struggled or gone through adversity do, at some point, reach a phase where they are in a better space than they were before, reflecting some of those positive outcomes that I talked about on the earlier slide. So that doesn't mean that's a guarantee, but it means that does tend to happen. Okay, so we also looked a lot really early on trying to find a kind of roadmap to guide us to think, what's going to happen? What can we expect to see? And so there's quite a lot of literature on disasters, and it's a whole field of medicine that I hadn't known about before, but there are a lot of disasters in the world, and there are a lot of literature out there telling us how communities have responded. So the very important thing, and I think we all know it now, is that the disaster itself is just the start of a really complex series of events. And I know when I hear about something on the news now, like Vanuatu, you think, oh my goodness, it's gone off the news now, but how long that is going to take to recover, and how people's lives have been so dramatically changed. So it's not a one-off thing, a disaster. It's just the start of the process. The literature also tells us that the exposure gradient is really important. So what that means is, and again it sounds quite obvious, is that the more exposed you are, the more you've lost, the more likely you are to have difficulties. And also when you think about exposure, you have to think not just about what happened in the earthquake, but what happened afterwards, you know, whether you lost your house, whether you lost your business, whether someone you knew was injured. It's not just what happens right at that moment. And another important factor is when you ask people how they are. Because if you ask someone a few weeks after going through at the earthquakes, they will have a lot of symptoms because they're completely normal. Whereas if you ask people the same questions 2 years after an event, the rates of those reporting difficulties will be much, much less. So again, you have to look at when do you ask the questions. It also depends what you measure, but really all the literature says is that distress immediately is extremely common. Those symptoms I talked about earlier, not sleeping, being very jumpy, being very on edge, they're very, very common in most people immediately after a disaster. How long they last depends whether it's a one-off event or whether, like us, you had the aftershocks and further earthquakes. So distress immediately is extremely common. The other thing it tells us is that despite that, the majority of people, vastly the majority, do not have ongoing mental health difficulties after a disaster, even those who've been really, really highly exposed, which is quite remarkable when you think what people are juggling with and going through. But having said that, there are a significant minority who do develop problems, and those are things like post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'm going to talk about a bit later, but other things as well, like depression and other anxiety disorders. But the literature also says, but there's lots of confounding things. Like a lot of these studies don't have a measure of what difficulties were in the community before the earthquake or the disaster happened. So you can't actually directly compare it often. Lots of people relate everything to the difficulty they've had, so they put everything down to the earthquake, so that might be a bias as well. So this is a summary of what the literature tells us. Most people's outcomes are the green and the blue lines. So they have some difficulties, but they rapidly, if it's only a single event disaster, come back to normal. Or they have some short-lived difficulties with sleep, concentration, anxiety, but they improve. And so the green and the blue lines represent about 80% of people do that. But a significant number have difficulties from when the disaster happened and continue to have them if they're untreated. And a small proportion have difficulties where they were sort of struggling and then something happens and they have really bad difficulties. So we have to be able to hold both things in our head, that most people are okay eventually, but there are a small group, but it's a significant number of people who are going to have ongoing difficulties. So I want to talk a little bit about resilience, and I hate that word probably just less than I hate the new normal, but you know, we haven't got a better word for resilience yet. It developed from engineering terms, and it means doesn't mean that you're absolutely fine, but what it means is you can adapt to what you've been through and manage to function. Some people say they add the word thrive on the end of that. I think that's just way too positive. I think it's good enough to get through a bad event and be coping and have adapted to that. What we also know is we used to think that really bad things were not that common. But actually, about 60% of people have experienced a really traumatic event in their lives. That's an awful lot of people. So bad things can happen, and they do happen, and they're actually much more common than we thought they were. A lot of the work on resilience has actually come from childhood follow-up studies where they've looked at children who've been through really, really adverse experiences but have grown up fine. And people think, how could they? You know, they've had such a adverse experience throughout their early development, but they have turned out all right. And what that's been described as is ordinary magic, that actually kids somehow, innately, despite huge adversity, can cope. Not all of them, but they can. So what do we know predicts resilience? I've broken this down into things that happen before a bad thing happens, before a traumatic event, things that happen at the time of the event, and things that happen after the event. So before the event, it's better age-wise if you're not very young. And there has been some reports about that older people did do worse, but more recent research has actually suggested that older people seem to do remarkably well, and they describe that as they've learnt a lot through their lives, and they've already coped with quite a lot of adversity, and they see this as another thing that they can deal with. Gender, males do better than women in most of the research. Whether they have been previously exposed to bad events. This is an interesting debatable area, because some people say that being exposed to a trauma before predisposes you to having a bad outcome. But actually, when you look at that more closely, it's being exposed to a traumatic thing in your past and having post-traumatic stress disorder predisposes you to having difficulties. But actually, going through bad things, and if you manage them, is described as actually a sort of mastery skill that you've learned you can deal with it. And then when another disaster happens, actually you're already pre-armed. And then personality factors. This is definitely evident. So people who are really quite optimistic, always beforehand. They've got lots of coping skills. They don't worry about things. I think we all know people like that. I've got a ridiculously optimistic husband. He's just, every problem is an opportunity, and but he truly does think like that, and he's not making it up. But people like that are really quite resilient. Then what happens at the time of the event? So we've talked about what you actually experience. If it's really bad, it's going to be more difficult. But it's important as well to realize that what you feel at the time is really important. So a lot of the people that we've seen with bad reactions describe that when the earthquake happened, they were absolutely convinced they were going to die. And they might have been in the same room as someone who experienced physically the same thing, but their colleague didn't feel that. So your perception of the experience is really, really powerful. And your reaction at the time. So people who have difficulties tend to have hyper-aroused feelings. They're panicking, absolutely terrified. Or some people describe dissociation, where they lose time for what happened at the earthquakes. They felt like everything was going on in slow motion. They sometimes describe themselves being out of their body, looking down on themselves, a really quite shut down response. But either of those things, either being very aroused or quite shut down, is a risk for not doing so well. But after the event, this actually has a very big effect size. So those things I've talked about are relevant, but what happens after the event is also relevant. And these are things that we can do stuff about, actually. So people who have good support tend to do better. People who are well connected tend to do better. People, obviously, who have less bad things happen do better. But we can do something about that if we can pressurize politicians to make fewer bad things happen in terms of insurance rebuilding. And then coping styles have been described as not being, you do well if you're more optimistic. if you keep focused on current goals and don't get consumed by the concerns of the earthquakes and your home and things. And very importantly, people carry on enjoying the things they used to do before. Whereas people who don't do so well, those drop off. So we know all that from the literature, and we also know, as I've talked about, that a minority of people do get mental health problems. So this is something called post-traumatic stress disorder, which is when people who've experienced a really life-threatening event have re-experiencing symptoms from that. They constantly go over it. They have nightmares about it. They have flashbacks about it where they're reliving it almost in real time, going through it again. They're terrified of further earthquakes. They avoid places because they're scared of earthquakes. They're not sleeping. They can't concentrate. They're incredibly jumpy, incredibly hyper-aroused. They're really terrified. And what we've found with the people who've come with those difficulties, that almost universally they felt they were going to die at the time of the earthquakes. Whether or not actually what they went through was worse than anyone else, what mattered was their perception of it. And we've also seen a group of people who were rescue workers, demolition workers, worked with the ambulance, rescuing people, and those experiences constantly go through their mind. And then we've had people who've had previous post-traumatic stress disorder from some other terrible thing that's happened to them. And for them, every time there was an aftershock or an earthquake, they'd get a memory or a flashback of their previous trauma. So not of the earthquakes, but their previous time they felt so under threat. But also remembering that people don't just get PTSD, they also get depression or other anxiety disorders. And there's been lots of talk in the press about increased numbers of referrals to mental health services as time's gone on. So this is very much turning the resilience side of the literature the other way round, and we've pretty much covered that. So people who've had previous traumatic events or mental health history are more at risk. What happens to them at the time of the event, and then what happens to them afterwards. So that's all about previous disasters. Now, what have we actually seen in Canterbury? So we know this because there's been various samples that have been done in the form of surveys. So CERA have done a survey repeatedly over the last 3 years. There's also been a survey by the All Right campaign that people may know about. There's been various employee surveys. We've also looked at patterns of dispensing of medication that you might expect with mental health problems. And then there's been some cross-sectional research, and then a very, very strong longitudinal study, which has been able to look at people before the earthquakes and after. So I'll just fly through that. But what I wanted to emphasize by these following 2 slides is that it's almost like politicians or the media want us to say how Christchurch is. So on the one hand, you get messages that we're all in trouble, we're all taking antidepressants, we're all taking anxiolytics. And then the other side of the coin is actually we're all great because we've been through this and we've come through this relatively unscathed, and we've learned a lot from that. Now, the fact of the matter is both are true, but they're not the whole story, and the whole story is more complex than that. That some people are having difficulties, and some people do feel they've really come through this and learned a lot from it. But there's a wide spectrum in between as well. So, what have we seen in Christchurch? Very much like the previous literature, we saw very widespread acute reactions to the earthquakes and aftershocks. Then we saw the effects of the secondary stressors. And what we saw, again reflecting the previous literature, is that the majority of people are functioning, but they say they're not great. There are words like, I'm bone tired, I'm running close to empty. Employers talk about people having a very narrow focus and a reduced capacity for taking on more work. A small minority described themselves as thriving, and a significant but bigger minority described themselves as having mental health problems. Also, that the type of stressors have changed over time. So in 2012, most people reported that the aftershocks and the earthquakes were the really big thing. In 2013, it was the insurance, the rebuild, the big decisions people were making. And now people talk about the daily grind, which I'm sure is a coffee, but I don't mean it like that. But it's just living with constant damage to the infrastructure. Everything's hard work. Getting to work, the roads are difficult, the house is difficult, the landscape's difficult, everything's difficult. And there's becoming groups which are almost being left behind and having more difficulties. So these are now people with unsettled claims, 4 years on after the earthquakes. People with repair issues, either those that have to be done or have already been done. People with low income or health disability. And what that's really emphasizing to us is that we really have a role in pressurizing politicians and insurance companies to alleviate these stresses as much as they can. That is a challenge. Right, now turning to prescribing rates of different medications that we might expect to be increased if people were having difficulties with anxiety and depression. So we've been able to look at those and compare the DHB to the national levels of prescribing. So as a percentage of the national levels of prescribing. So these are for sedatives and anxiolytics. So anxiolytics which are prescribed during the daytime for anxiety, and sedatives which will be helping people to sleep. So what this shows us is that at the time of the February earthquake, there were increased prescribing rates of sleep. This yellow is the sedatives, and the blue is the anxiolytics. But they were very short-lived. So people did take medication for anxiety or sleep, but not over a prolonged period. That's good. We didn't want everyone to be using medication excessively, so that is good. But we also found that antidepressants didn't increase. So I talked about the mental health problems that people might get are often conditions that will be treated by antidepressants. So post-traumatic stress disorder is also treated by an antidepressant. But there have been no increases in antidepressant prescribing. This big drop, I think, is just because people left Christchurch. So it wasn't a dramatic cure at the time. But there clearly hasn't been an increase, which is interesting. Now, this was a study that Peter was involved in. It was a survey of people who were all around 50 at the time of the earthquake. And this again showed probably what the other surveys have showed to a degree, lower scores on measures of mental health and social functioning, more so on mental health than on physical health. And although rates of depression were a little higher, they weren't significantly higher than comparisons they compared with. Okay, and I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about this study. So this is a study by David Ferguson's group, which is called the Christchurch Health and Development Study. And it involves 1,000 children who've been followed up since birth, and they're now around 35. It's a remarkable study anyway. But at the time of the earthquake, I think only David Ferguson could have made this happen, but of the 1,000, about 500 were in Christchurch at the time of the earthquake, and 500 weren't. So he had this amazing natural experiment where he could truly compare what exposure to the earthquake did to this group who experienced the earthquake in comparison to the group that didn't. And he's got all these measures from how they were beforehand, before the earthquake happened. And very little research has got that kind of measure, before and after, and one group exposed and one group not exposed. So it's a remarkable study. And what this found was that, as we've heard from the other literature, increasing exposure to the earthquakes resulted in an increased rate of mental health disorders. So he compared, if you look at the different disorders, so in people who weren't exposed, so weren't in Christchurch, the rates of PTSD were 1.7%. In the groups that were highly exposed, but only the highly exposed group, the rates of PTSD were much higher, 5.2%. And similarly for depression, not in Christchurch, the time of the earthquake, and in Christchurch and badly exposed, much higher rates. So he was able to say really quite conclusively that the high exposure cohort had higher rates of mental disorder than the group that weren't exposed. And the increase was due to the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and smoking. And smoking went up a lot. And from that, they could say that there was an 8% increase in mental health disorders from the earthquakes. So it's not massive, but it is a significant number. And that's very similar to figures that were talked about right at the beginning, that Sir Peter Gluckman, who's the government scientific officer, said that 5% of people would be expected to have mental health problems from the earthquakes. Okay, we've also we advertised and asked for people to volunteer if they felt they were resilient from the earthquakes, whatever they felt that might mean. Could they contact us? And we asked them some questions, and we did some biological measures as well, in order to compare them with people who were very badly affected. And we asked people to just tell us about their earthquake experiences and what they had found helpful. So the resilient group of people, at the time of the earthquake, they very interestingly describe things in really quite factual ways. They talk about the power of the event. It was amazing how much the ground shook. It was amazing how everyone helped each other out. I'm so lucky I wasn't in that building that fell down. Now, whereas people with bad difficulties with post-traumatic stress, they are terrified by what happened. They can think of nothing positive, and it's all very negative and catastrophic. And if they weren't in a building that fell down, they would never use the words lucky. They would say, but what if I had been? And I almost was there. So really different themes. And when the people who are resilient talk about what's helped them, they generally talk about really keep a very optimistic frame of mind. They don't focus on things that are negative. They don't focus on things they can't control, because there's no point in that. They really keep going with the things they like, their own goals. They listen to their bodies, and they recognize what keeps them well, and they do it. And they often describe things like making meaning out of things, that they can see what they've learned from it. And that's a theme that has been echoed from trauma research from way back. So people who've looked at people who've survived the Holocaust, the people that don't have PTSD usually describe they got meaning out of it, they learnt things about themselves and other people that they've used positively. And one other thing that we've also found, which was also from the Christchurch Health and Development Study, was that the people who had the greatest earthquake exposure often were the people who had the biggest positive effects. So that's actually, again, talking about, look, if you can get through this adversity and do well, you can do really well. And interestingly, women talked about having the greatest distress at the time of the earthquakes, but also they talked about having the greatest benefits as well. So, it's an interesting area to think about why that's happening. And some of the biology might explain that I'm going to touch on shortly. So how do we make sense of all that? Because it is quite complex, I think. I think we can say that resilience is the majority response, that most people are okay, they've adapted, they may not be completely out of the woods, but they're on the way to it, and they won't have long-term mental health effects from it. But there are a minority who have. I suppose the other thing we need to think about is that this environment we've been in, as well as being very difficult, isn't normal in terms of what's been available to people. That actually there's been a lot of support put in that other places in the country haven't had. And so we have to remember that it's not a completely level playing field. And we also have to remember that non-help seeking is very common. We really often hear how people say, well, I don't need you because there are other people worse off than me. Or I shouldn't be like this because I haven't lost so much. So, just because people aren't coming forward doesn't mean they don't have difficulties. And I think particularly now we need to remember that there are people out there who are still struggling and how we can actually put them in touch with the help that they do need. If these are the difficulties they're having at the moment, they should be getting help. Okay, I just wanted to have one slide about animals, because when I was thinking about the neuroscience, a lot of what we know about neuroscience is based on animal models. And I thought, I hadn't thought about that, because also when you think about what we've been through with the aftershocks, there isn't really an animal model that they've had before that would explain that. And I don't think any ethics committee would allow you to do that to any animal anyway. So I spoke with a vet who's been very involved in companion animals. So he said he couldn't talk about other animals. But what his experiences were, he said that there's been lots of reports, and I've heard this, that the birds left before the earthquakes hit. And it's well recognized that animals do have a kind of more acute sense of their senses than we do. And what he talked about with dogs and cats was that they fled initially. So the fight-flight response, they flew. Not bird fly, but they flew. And a lot of them got lost from their owners, but they actually hadn't gone very far. They usually gone within their territory and were just hiding out there. A lot of them had exaggerated startle responses, that jumpiness that I talked about that we had. Animals had that a lot. And there were lots of prescribing of anxiolytics, but most of them gradually improved. And he also said that there was a huge variation in the spectrum of response. So again, just like us, because we are animals. So there were some who were absolutely, completely not affected, and others who were jumping into owners' beds at the slightest aftershock. So he said he got a Rottweiler and it used to jump, almost before the aftershock hit. So if he didn't wait with the aftershock, he certainly won't when the Rottweiler lands on him. And the risks seem similar. This same Rottweiler, he was a rescue dog and had been previously traumatized, he thought. And interestingly, he said, look, a lot of the animals reflected their owner's response. And we'd seen that in children as well. So if there was an anxious child, there was often an anxious parent. So if there was an anxious dog, there was often an anxious owner. So turning to the neuroscience now. When we're thinking about all this, we need to be able to explain how we all need to be able to respond to a very frightening experience. So I think we all get that now. Our bodies need to be wired to do that. And having been through what we've been through here, you can see the necessity of that. So I'm going to talk about the fear network, and then what the normal response to fear is, and then how that might get aggravated and set off if we're repeatedly going and experiencing aftershocks. And then how might persistent stress, so this is the secondary stress stuff, the juggling all these balls, how might that affect us? And then talk about PTSD. So you don't need to remember the details of this, but this is the fear network that we all have in our brains. So we see something, we hear something, or for us, we feel something, the ground shaking. It goes into the thalamus, and then into this part of the brain called the amygdala, which is almost like the computer comparator part of our brain. So this sends messages up to the thinking part of the brain, the frontal cortex. Do I need to be scared about this? It has pathways to the hippocampus, which is involved with memory. Have I been frightened by this before? And then it coordinates the kind of fight-flight response, the autonomic pathways, the sympathetic nervous system, the hypothalamus, and the release of cortisol. So we've all got that. We all need to have that. Sorry. Right, so when we're in a really frightening situation, we need to respond really quickly and get safe. So the amygdala gets activated. And what that does is it focuses all our attention on the frightening thing. And it prepares us to fight or run, or in some cases, freeze, not move. The frontal part of our brain is not so important. We don't need to be thinking, what am I getting for shopping? You know, what are we having for dinner tonight? It's completely irrelevant. We just need to get safely out. So the frontal part of our brain gets moved offline because we don't need it. Oh. We also know that when we're in a frightening situation, we get a big release of noradrenaline. That focuses our attention on things. It puts our blood pressure up. It makes our heart pump faster. It prepares us to get out physically. Releases cortisol, and that's trying to monitor the response so it doesn't carry on, that it can switch off. So in a frightening situation, the amygdala is what's driving our brains. Now, when we're exposed to frequent aftershocks that are making us experience frightening things repeatedly, unpredictably, in a way we can't control, the amygdala is going to get even more activated. It's almost firing on its own kind of engine because it's repeatedly getting activated. And that's what's causing us to do this exaggerated startle response that I talked about. And it also explains why other stimuli get conditioned to have the same response. So something that feels even slightly like that activates the amygdala because it's getting a memory for frightening experiences. And gradually that will reduce if the aftershocks stop. But I think we all notice that happening, and you can think, yeah, I'm getting more human again now. I'm not jumping at everything. And then there will be a few more aftershocks, and it'll immediately start up again because it really easily gets re-triggered. Now, what might happen to us if we're under persistent stress? And Rob Gordon, I don't know if you've heard him talk, he's an expert from Australia, who's a very wise man, has talked about this a lot. And he talks about that what happens is, again, our amygdala is what's driving us, that we focus just on the threat in front of us. We think really narrowly. We don't think about the bigger things. We just think about the problem. I must get EQC sorted. I must do this. We stop thinking about other things. And actually, the things that usually do us good are the other things. The exercising, the doing something enjoyable, the spending time with your partner. All that drops off. And that explains why we're in this constantly exhausted state and why we can't remember anything. So we're being driven by this amygdala. What does this look like? Most of us can look in the mirror and describe this, but it's this head-down, blinkered approach to things. We try to constantly deal with the stress. If I just get that done, I just get that done, I just get that done, it'll all be okay. But it isn't, because it's a relentless list. And we're not thinking strategically, we're just thinking about the thing in front of us. And we've stopped doing all the things that actually are going to make us better. And that's going to have big impacts on our health and well-being. And all the things that actually are what really matter in life. Not getting to the end of the list, but being well, having a happy family, and a good career. So, what we think is people who are resilient haven't got that hyperactive amygdala. They've had it, but they've done things about it that have switched it, toned it down. So it can still respond when it needs to, but it's not driving the whole system. I'm not going to cover that. The question is, why are they able to do that? People who are resilient, why can they do it and other people not do it? And again, you can think of that in different ways, but it's because their fear network is being much more controlled by the top down. Because of things, usually it's because of things they're doing. Usually it's these things that they're doing after the event. To an extent they were doing them before, but they're definitely doing them now. They've got good social factors, they're well connected, they keep on doing the things that keep them well. They're much more optimistic, and they're very flexible in the way they cope with things. So it's not a prescriptive, if we all do this, we'll be fine. What really keeps you well is you to be able to do this at one time and this at another time. And it's that flexibility that the really resilient people seem to be showing. Okay, so finally turning to post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I've told you what that looks like in terms of the re-experiencing symptoms, particularly with these memories, flashbacks, and nightmares, and the avoidance that people have and being very hyper-aroused. What seems to be different about the people with PTSD is, again, they're being driven by their amygdala. But there's also that they have done something at the time of the trauma, the memories about their trauma have got lodged in a way that isn't normal for memories. So they're not processed in a way that normally we process things. Because normally when something happens to us, we have a story about it. We have a story about what we were doing before, what happened, and then what happened afterwards. With people with PTSD, the experience has been so overwhelming, there's no processing that's gone on, and it all gets stored in a very primitive, sensory way. So things like smells or sounds bring the memory back, and people can't control it, and it's a terrifying experience. So in treatment, not only do you need to control the amygdala, but you also need to teach people ways of dealing with those memories so they can process them in a normal way. So they don't get erased, but they are not reactivated in this terrifying way that they have been previously. So finally, what will help all of us? We've talked about what would help people with PTSD. Absolutely, it is dealing with the real practical stressors. I've no doubt that if we really dealt with those, it would help a lot of people. But we also need to focus on doing things that help our well-being, which is not a passive thing. It's something you actually have to do. And a lot of us know about it, but it's more than knowing about it. We've actually got to do something about it. Because we know that although some of your well-being is predetermined by your genes, the ridiculously happy people that are all around us at home, but a lot of it is by things you can subsequently do, and you truly can change this. There's been lots of research about this. This is positive psychology. But it's things like nurturing social relationships, doing things you love doing. These are called flow activities, things where you really lose yourself in it, like, for example, doing art or doing music or reading, anything. We have all got them. Really look at what's important to you and making yourself do it. Stop overthinking and constantly ruminating about things you can't change, because it doesn't help. The UK have put a lot of effort into looking at this, and they've come up with the 5 ways to well-being that you've probably heard a lot about, that the All Right campaign is based on. And all these things do is they activate the thinking part of your brain and suppress that overactive amygdala. So these are the 5 things. So giving of your time, connecting with people, keeping learning, being active, and taking notice, mindfulness type approaches. And the All Right campaign, you've probably seen about town, is entirely based on doing that. And in getting it into schools, because, as I said, there's a lot about knowing it, but actually doing it is what's going to make the difference. So, The take-home messages. Absolutely, we need to sort the practical stressors. We absolutely need to support and treat the people who need it, and there are people who need it, and still there are people that need it. And we need to recognise, but not only recognise, actually do the things that keep us well. Oh, I thought there was one more slide. There isn't. But the last slide is thanks to my amazing colleagues who've actually done a lot of this work. So thank you for that.